What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and I hope you're all doing well today. News about patch 9.2 Eternity's End has already started to bubble to the surface, and one of the features I'm most curious about is double legendaries. This is currently intended to allow players to use any one class legendary with their Covenant-specific legendary as well. For rogues in particular, I can envision a couple potential changes to the balance of Covenant representation based on the legendary combinations that will be available and the possible synergies they might share with each spec, which is what I'll be poking at in this video today. This is of course a very hypothetical video and is more so just my early thoughts on the potential changes that this could make for each of the rogue specs, since it's entirely possible that some legendary tuning or tweaks could happen before 9.2 or during 9.2. Also, please keep in mind I generally look at things from a PvE perspective, so I'll mainly reference things like Mythic Plus and single target or multi-target situations, but for all I know, some combinations of legendaries that I mention or ones I don't even mention might be really strong in PvP too. Because of totally not bias and just because I feel like it, let's start with Outlaw rogues. Outlaw has a number of pretty solid class and spec specific legendaries at its disposal. Celerity is basically the de facto choice in a majority of situations since it's just free damage amps and procs without really having to worry about anything or changing your playstyle or rotation at all. However, there are a couple other choices that aren't even that bad right now, and with the right Covenant legendary choice could actually provide extra synergy, though I feel other combinations might still be a bit lacking. For instance, Necrolord is currently one of the best choices for Outlaw, and the Death Spike legendary is actually really good in Mythic Plus, or basically any time that you can benefit off of the charge resets of Serrated Bone Spike. Currently though, I would foresee Necrolord as being a really heavy one-trick pony sort of choice in patch 9.2, and would probably only be pertinent in Mythic Plus. Death Spike is a virtually 0% DPS gain in single target, since the Death Spike legendary just shoots an extra bone spike, and if there's no extra targets, it doesn't shoot two at the same target unfortunately, which leaves Celerity carrying the damage on boss fights. Although again, Death Spike does have some very strong usage on trash. The Covenant I think that will see the strongest overall gains though is going to be Kyrian. Resounding Clarity is already a pretty strong legendary, and is useful in both single target and multi-target situations, unlike basically all the other Covenant powers which pretty heavily lean one way or the other. On top of that, it will also have some added synergy with the Deathly Shadows legendary, which gives a nice damage boost for 12 seconds and 5 combo points every time you press Vanish. Since Resounding Clarity anima charges combo points 2 through 5, we'll be getting even more free combo points than ever before, since every time you spend exactly the number of combo points as that anima charged point, it functions as though you would use 7, and this includes the cooldown reduction effect that's for both True Bearing and Restless Blades. This all adds up to more vanishes more often, which should pull Deathly Shadows ahead of Celerity in performance with this nifty bit of synergy. Not that Celerity won't still be a really good choice, but Deathly Shadows is actually looking like it might be competitive and beat it. For the Night Fae, Toxic Onslaught is a bit of an underperformer and is mainly only useful in single target situations, since you apply Vendetta to whatever target you hit with Sepsis thanks to the legendary, but you do also gain the Subtlety cooldown Shadow Blades, which does increase combo point generation and deal extra shadow damage for free, so that does affect AoE a little bit. I don't really see any super strong combinations of legendaries to tie in with Toxic Onslaught either, and even its single target isn't really all that amazing. Venthyr Outlaw is a bit of a one-dimensional choice since both Obedience and really the Flagellation power in general are single target focused if you're Outlaw, since Outlaw doesn't really have a true combo point generator for AoE situations or AoE finishers like Subtlety and Assassination do. This isn't necessarily a bad thing by any means, but it does detract from the cleave damage potential of the spec while favoring burst single target. And even trying to use something like the Dreadblade's talent to dump even more combo points out while you're doing Flagellation. Obedience basically actually causes Flagellation to desynchronize cooldowns with Dreadblades, which was an idea I had for a moment that sounded kinda cool, and then I realized it really wouldn't work out that well. For Outlaw, my hunch overall is on Kyrian being the best choice in virtually any situation, though Venthyr Outlaw might give you a bit of an edge in burst your single target, and Necrolord is really going all in on Mythic Plus AoE trash damage type stuff. Subtlety, on the other hand, has a bit of a different dilemma. Almost all of the Covenant-specific powers, besides Death Spike, are actually quite a bit better than their class and spec-specific ones. Right now that isn't really a big deal, but in 9.2, when other specs like Outlaw have multiple strong options as well as a couple good Covenant legendaries, they might not really see quite as much of a gain. Venthyr Subtlety is still very likely to be a great combination with how effectively they can spew out combo points to fuel the Obedience legendary and to just get more flagellation damage out there. Tying into that with Finality will just mean that every other finisher is going to do more damage, and you'll still be getting that nice big versatility buff and super short cooldown of flagellation in both single target and multi-target situations. Necrolord Subtlety will probably still be very, very underrepresented, since Death Spike is just really not something that fits in with Subtlety like at all, basically. Serrated Bone Spike works as a decent filler, but it's virtually untouched in heavy AoE since you get more combo points more easily with just Shuriken Storm or Shuriken Tornado. And in single target, Death Spike is virtually a 0% gain as I mentioned earlier, other than replacing a couple backstabs here and there. Unfortunately, I think the double legendary thing will just alienate a lot of folks from Necrolord overall, since Death Spike is such a mixed bag of a legendary and still has a couple of quirks with it that have never been addressed, like bleeds overwriting each other and causing the loss of Bone Spike charge resets. But even if that was fixed, and if both spikes gave Bone Spike charges when they fell off, I doubt you'd see many Necrolord Subtlety rogues in any competitive aspect at least. Night Phase Toxic Onslaught is actually not a bad option as Subtlety, since you get a pretty big meaty Vendetta debuff and faster everything thanks to Adrenaline Rush every time you use Sepsis, but this legendary is again very single target focused when you could just play Venthyr and get great AoE and single target. There is also the fact that Toxic Onslaught is just a very clunky legendary to use since you have to wait for Sepsis to fall off before you get the Vendetta and Adrenaline Rushes to trigger, which means having to line up even more things later in the future, which is just messy and frankly kind of unintuitive, even for a spec that revolves around timing short cooldowns like Subtlety. Kyrian Subtlety is one I think might have some viability, at least in single target. Resounding Clarity means even bigger finishers with all those anima-charged combo points, and Finality makes your next finisher of the same type do even more damage as well. The problem with Subtlety in this regard is in situations where you're doing cleave or AoE, you're regularly just going to spam Shuriken Storms for combo points, and since you get a combo point for every enemy you hit, this means you'd probably be missing out on hitting the right number of combo points to trigger that anima-charged hit, which kinda defeats the purpose of the Resounding Clarity legendary if you don't use it at all. In single target, this is much more manageable as you have multiple attacks that generate combo points in varying amounts, as well as free combo points that trickle in steadily via the Shadow Technique passive just from auto-attacking. Thankfully, since we can swap covenants whenever we want, this isn't like an end of the world situation, but if you happen to be a person who plays Subtlety in virtually all content, my current assumption is that Venthyr is still looking like the best overall choice, with Kyrian maybe being a thing in single target situations. Lastly, Assassination. This is another spec that I feel won't see too much variation and is probably most likely to have just one covenant that'll be ideal overall. Venthyr Assassination strongly benefits from Obedience in all forms of PvE content and is frankly the strongest performing covenant legendary of the four. Currently, Dashing Scoundrel has become a very popular choice too, since we have access to Domination Shard sets, and most importantly is the Frost set. However, in 9.2 that will be going away, so I imagine the popularity of this legendary will decrease. That and the fact that Dashing Scoundrel is a pure single target legendary, whereas there are other options that might fill more niches. This does leave room for the old standby of Doomblade to probably become the secondary legendary choice to pair with Obedience, at least for single target. Master Assassin is still no slouch in Mythic Plus, if you can get a decent amount of re-stealths, but I imagine the Zul'jik Insignia will be much more ideal, especially in higher keys where enemies tend to live longer, allowing for more of that execute bonus damage. This next one is a bit more unfortunate, as currently Necrolord Assassination is actually not half bad by any means, especially since the bleed from Serrated Bone Spike adds to the bonus bleed effect of the Doomblade legendary. However, Death Spike is once again very exclusively a multi-target legendary that relies on lots of enemies dying for resets of Bone Spikes, meaning it does next to nothing in single target. In multi-target, you spend way more time applying garrots and using Phantom Knives for big bursts of combo point generation, so Bone Spike becomes a lot less useful for a spec that can spam AoE finishers like Crimson Tempest with AoE generators like Phantom Knives in between. And with the target cap removals of both of these abilities, that kinda just further pushes Death Spike into the not very useful territory for Assassination. With this new setup of requiring one of the legendaries to be a Covenant one, This in turn means some covenants are going to be inadvertently seeing less usage by being forced to pick up a potentially not useful legendary. Which again brings us back to Night Fae, and honestly at this point I kind of feel bad for having to say how really not great this legendary power is over and over. Toxic Onslaught is just really a single target effect that is clunky and kind of really inconvenient, though it is better than both Kyrian and Necrolord for single target power. If someone was going to go all in on single target damage though, you'd be better off as Venthyr, and even then you'd get your best AoE legendary at the same time by doing it. Maybe if there's some tuning done or just a rework of how Sepsis does its thing, and maybe this legendary can become a bit more usable and better, but until then, I have a hard time seeing this be the play in patch 9.2. Another unlikely sight to see would be a Kyrian Assassination Rogue, as Resounding Clarity is just not really feasible at all for Assassination to use. Since combo point generation as an Assassination Rogue relies a bit on luck via the Seal Fate passive, which makes your combo point generators generate an extra combo point when you critically hit a target, it just isn't practical to be able to consistently hit all of the anima charged combo points. Let alone in AoE, where your Fan of Knives is likely to be getting you full combo points over and over, completely negating the usefulness of this legendary, kinda like the same situation that Subtlety Rogue has. This result seems pretty cut and dry, honestly, and I imagine Venthyr Assassination really being the only promising and effective choice of the 4 covenants. This kinda really makes the whole, oh, you can swap covenants whenever you want quality of life change that they just put into the game feel like a bit of a moot point, at least if you're someone who really wants to try and get the most damage out of their character. Again, you can swap pretty easily, so it's not the end of the world, but I honestly quite can't understand the whole Covenant Legendary being the mandatory choice of the 2. I imagine it just comes down to some classes or specs having combinations that would have so much synergy that it'd generate a positive feedback loop so powerful it'd shatter the space-time continuum, and that'd require the balance team to actually, balance things and spend time tuning stuff, heaven forbid. Again, this is all speculation and just looking at what possibilities await us in patch 9.2, because for all I know, tier sets could come out that allow for completely different combinations of legendaries that might just work better with the effects, throwing all these ideas right into the trash, but it's always fun to hypothesize and speculate. Anyways folks, I hope you enjoyed this long-ish video of my thought process behind the whole double legendaries in patch 9.2 topic. Feel free to share your ideas or combinations that might be interesting or potent if I didn't mention one that you might have thought up. I'd be curious to hear what other things people might find possible. While you're at it, if you want of course, leaving a like on the video would be tremendously helpful, as the YouTube algorithm basically steals my socks and throws them in the woods whenever a video doesn't get any, and with winter coming soon, I'd like to not freeze my feet off. Or maybe that's just my dogs that do it, I don't know. As always, my appreciation and gratitude to all my viewers and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.